The story begins in the autumn of 1897, in a forgotten corner of the Colorado Rocky Mountains, where the wind never seemed to stop whispering through the pine trees. Travelers passing through the narrow trails often spoke of a settlement hidden deep between the cliffs, a place called Blackridge Valley. It was the kind of town that rarely appeared on maps. A place where strangers were noticed immediately. And where secrets had a way of surviving far longer than the people who created them. But what happened there in the winter of 1897 would become one of the strangest mysteries ever recorded in the American frontier. Because for 3 days, the quiet mining town of Blackridge Valley was visited by two boys who seemed to know things no living person could possibly know. And by the time they left, an entire town would be forced to confront the terrible truth buried beneath its foundations. The man who brought the boys to Blackridge Valley was a traveling preacher named Samuel Hale. Samuel was 36 years old, tall, thin, and weathered by years of walking between remote settlements across the American West. His coat was worn, his boots patched several times, and his Bible carried more creases than most men carried memories. He had spent the past decade wandering from town to town, offering sermons to communities that rarely saw a church minister. But Samuel Hale was not alone. Traveling beside him were his two sons, Elias and Jonah Hale. Twin brothers. Both 9 years old. Both quiet. And both deeply unsettling to anyone who spent more than a few minutes in their presence. At first glance, the boys looked identical. Same pale skin. Same dark hair. Same calm gray eyes that seemed to observe the world with an intensity far beyond their age. But those who paid attention quickly realized there was a difference between them. Elias spoke first. Jonah finished the thoughts. Often, they would answer questions before they were fully asked. Other times, they would stare at someone with a strange sadness, as if remembering something that had never been told. Samuel Hale had spent years trying to understand his sons. But even he didn't fully understand what they could do. The strange behavior began when the boys were only 5 years old. It started with small things. Elias once told a neighbor where to find a missing horse that had wandered miles into the forest. Jonah later described the exact location of a pocket watch that had been lost for months beneath a farmhouse floorboard. At first, Samuel believed it was coincidence. Children could be perceptive. Sometimes lucky. But as the boys grew older, their knowledge became more specific. More impossible. They would mention people they had never met. Describe events that had happened years before their birth. And sometimes, they spoke of terrible things that no one wanted to remember. Samuel's late wife, Margaret, had once told him something shortly before her death. She claimed that members of her family carried an old ability known in frontier folklore as the echo sight. According to her, certain people could sense the emotional echoes left behind by violent events. Memories imprinted into places. Tragedies that never fully disappeared. Samuel never believed in such things. Until his sons began describing crimes no one had confessed. Secrets no one had spoken. And tragedies no one wanted uncovered. The journey to Blackridge Valley had been difficult. The narrow mountain trails were slick with early winter ice, and the wind cut through their coats like knives. Samuel had nearly turned back twice. But the boys had insisted they needed to go forward. Jonah had said something strange the night before. "Someone there is waiting for us." Samuel had asked who. Jonah simply replied, "Someone who can't leave." Those words had haunted Samuel during the entire climb through the mountains. Blackridge Valley finally appeared late in the afternoon. It was smaller than Samuel expected. Roughly 150 residents lived there, most of them miners working in the silver deposits hidden in the surrounding hills. The town consisted of a few wooden buildings. A general store. A blacksmith shop. A small schoolhouse. And a modest church near the center of town. The church was run by Pastor Andrew Whitaker, a man in his early 50s who had lived in Blackridge Valley since its founding. Whitaker welcomed traveling preachers whenever they passed through. When Samuel and the boys arrived, Whitaker greeted them warmly. "Travelers are always welcome here," he said. But the pastor's friendly smile slowly faded when he noticed the twins. They were staring at the church. Not casually, but with a quiet focus that made Whitaker uncomfortable. That evening, the Hale family was invited to stay in the pastor's home. They shared a simple meal of bread, stew, and dried venison. For most of the evening, the conversation was ordinary. Whitaker asked about Samuel's travels. Samuel asked about the town's mining operations. But the mood changed suddenly when Elias spoke. "Your bell doesn't ring anymore." The pastor blinked in confusion. "What bell?" Elias pointed toward the church outside. "The one that used to ring before the accident." Whitaker's hand froze midair. "How do you know about that?" Samuel looked confused. "What accident?" Whitaker cleared his throat. "Oh, nothing serious." But Jonah quietly added, "A man fell from the bell tower 5 years ago." Silence filled the room. Whitaker slowly set down his spoon. "That's correct," he said cautiously. "But the bell tower was repaired years ago." Jonah shook his head slightly. "No," he said softly. "It was never repaired." Whitaker frowned. "What do you mean?" Jonah looked toward the church window. "The crack is still there." Later that night, unable to sleep, Pastor Whitaker walked outside with a lantern. He climbed the stairs of the small church tower. The wooden boards creaked beneath his feet. When he reached the top, he raised the lantern toward the bell support beam. And froze. There, hidden in the shadows, was a long vertical crack in the wood. A crack he had never noticed before. The structure holding the bell had indeed been damaged in the accident years earlier. But repairs had supposedly fixed it. Yet the crack remained. Exactly where the boys said it would be. Whitaker stared at it for a long time. For the first time that evening, he began to feel uneasy. The following morning, word spread quickly through Blackridge Valley that a traveling preacher had arrived. By midday, most of the town gathered at the church to hear Samuel Hale speak. The small wooden building filled quickly. Miners, families, children, all waiting for the sermon. Samuel began with a simple message about honesty and redemption. But throughout the sermon, the twins sat quietly near the front, watching the people, studying them. And several members of the congregation noticed something disturbing. Whenever the boys looked at someone, that person quickly looked away, as if suddenly uncomfortable. After the sermon ended, the congregation began leaving the church. That was when Elias stood up. He slowly walked toward a man standing near the door. The man was Harold Benton, one of the town's most respected miners. Elias looked up at him, then spoke quietly. "Your brother never ran away." Benton's face drained of color. "What?" Jonah stepped beside Elias. "He didn't leave for California," Jonah said. "He died in the mine." The entire room went silent. Benton stared at the boys. "That's impossible," he whispered. Elias tilted his head slightly. "You buried him yourself." The silence became suffocating. Because everyone in Blackridge Valley knew the story. 5 years earlier, Benton's younger brother had supposedly left town after an argument. No one had seen him since. But Elias continued speaking. "He didn't fall." Jonah finished the thought. "You pushed him." Gasps rippled through the room. Benton stumbled backward. "No, that's not true." Elias' voice remained calm. "You argued about the silver claim." Jonah nodded slowly. "You said you deserved it more." Benton's legs suddenly gave out. He collapsed onto the church floor. And for the first time, The people of Blackridge Valley realized something was very wrong. Within minutes, the entire town was whispering. How could the boys know something like that? No one had ever accused Benton of murder. There had been no witnesses. No investigation. Nothing. And yet the twins spoke as if they had watched it happen. Pastor Whitaker felt a deep chill crawl up his spine. Because he suddenly remembered something Jonah had said the night before. Someone there is waiting for us. Someone who can't leave. And in that moment, Whitaker began to wonder if the boys weren't just seeing secrets, but something far worse. That evening, Samuel Hale confronted his sons. What did you see today? The boys sat quietly beside the fire. Elias answered first. The mountain remembers. Jonah finished the thought. And it doesn't forget what happened here. Samuel felt his stomach tighten. What happened here? For a long moment, neither boy spoke. Then Elias finally said something that would haunt Samuel for the rest of his life. Papa. There are more bodies. Jonah whispered the final words. Many more. And that was the moment Samuel Hale realized something terrible. Blackridge Valley wasn't just hiding one secret. It was hiding an entire history of them. And the mountain itself seemed determined to reveal them all. The wind that night carried a strange tension through Blackridge Valley. It was the kind of quiet that made people uneasy without knowing why. After the confrontation in the church earlier that day, no one in town could stop talking about the Hale boys. The story had spread quickly through the small settlement. By sunset, every miner, shopkeeper, and ranch hand had heard the same unbelievable claim. 2 9-year-old boys had accused Harold Benton of murder. And Benton hadn't denied it. He had simply collapsed. Now the entire town was restless. Lanterns glowed in cabin windows long past the usual hour. Groups of men gathered outside the saloon whispering to one another. Even the dogs seemed uneasy, barking at nothing in the darkness beyond the town. Inside Pastor Whitaker's small home, Samuel Hale sat beside the fireplace watching his sons. Elias and Jonah sat across the room near the window. Neither of them spoke. They simply stared toward the mountains that surrounded the valley like silent walls. Samuel rubbed his temples, exhaustion pulling at him. Tell me exactly what you saw today, he said quietly. Elias didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward his brother. Jonah nodded slightly. Then Elias spoke. Not Saul. Samuel frowned. What do you mean? Jonah answered. We remembered. The words made Samuel's chest tighten. Remembered what? Elias slowly turned his eyes toward him. What happened to them? Samuel leaned forward. To who? Jonah whispered the answer. The ones buried in the mountain. A chill crawled down Samuel's spine. He had heard the boys say strange things before. But something about the way Jonah said those words felt different. He sounded sad. Not frightened. Sad. Samuel lowered his voice. How many? For a long moment, the boys remained silent. Then Elias said softly. More than the town knows. Samuel exhaled slowly. What happened in that mine today, with Benton, was that connected to the others? Jonah nodded. Some of them. Samuel stared at them. Some. Elias looked back toward the mountains again. The mountain remembers everything. The next morning began with thick gray clouds rolling across the valley. Blackridge Valley usually woke early. But that morning, the town felt heavy. Uneasy. Whispers followed the Hale family wherever they went. Some people stared. Others avoided looking at them entirely. Harold Benton had not appeared since collapsing in the church. Rumor claimed he had locked himself inside his cabin. By midday, the town sheriff arrived at Pastor Whitaker's door. His name was Sheriff Caleb Rourke. A broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes and a thick mustache that made him look perpetually serious. He removed his hat when Whitaker opened the door. "Morning, Pastor." Whitaker nodded. "Sheriff." Rourke glanced past him toward the room where Samuel and the boys sat. "I hear you've got some unusual guests." Whitaker hesitated. "Yes." Rourke stepped inside. His boots thudded against the wooden floor as he approached the table where Samuel sat. "You're the traveling preacher," he said. Samuel stood and offered a polite nod. "Yes, sir." "Samuel Hale." Rourke's gaze shifted to the boys. "And those two are the ones making accusations." Samuel's jaw tightened. "They're children." Rourke leaned against the wall. "Children who just accused a man of murder in front of half the town." Samuel chose his words carefully. "They simply speak about things they feel." Rourke's eyes narrowed. "That so?" He crouched slightly so he was level with the twins. Elias and Jonah watched him calmly. Rourke spoke slowly. "You boys ever been in the Silver Ridge mine?" Both boys shook their heads. "No." Rourke tilted his head. "Then how did you know what happened to Benton's brother?" Elias answered. "He told us." The sheriff blinked. Rourke gestured toward the entrance. "Then lead the way." The group moved inside. The mine smelled of damp earth and rusted metal. Their lanterns cast flickering shadows along the tunnel walls. After several minutes of walking, they reached a blocked passage where a collapsed support beam had sealed part of the mine. Rourke frowned. "This is where the collapse happened." He looked back toward the twins. "This is the only tunnel." Elias stepped forward slowly. "No." Jonah pointed to the wall. "There." One of the miners raised his lantern closer. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Then someone noticed it. A narrow gap between the rocks. Barely visible. Rourke's face darkened. "Clear it." The miners began pulling away stones. Within minutes, the gap widened enough to reveal a hidden passage. A tunnel no one had known existed. The air inside smelled stale. As they stepped through, Jonah's voice echoed softly. "He's still here." The miners moved deeper. 20 feet in, one of them suddenly stopped. "Sheriff." Rourke stepped beside him. The lantern light revealed something half buried beneath rubble. Bones. Human bones. A skull stared upward from the dirt. Benton collapsed to his knees. "Oh God." The sheriff slowly removed his hat. No one spoke. Because everyone in that tunnel realized the same thing. The boys had been right. And that realization brought a far more terrifying question. If they knew about this body, what else did they know? Later that evening, Sheriff Rourke sat alone in the church studying a map of the valley. Samuel approached quietly. "You found him?" Rourke nodded. "Benton's brother." He leaned back in his chair. "Exactly where your boys said." Samuel sighed. "I wish I could explain it." Rourke studied him carefully. "You believe them?" Samuel hesitated. "I believe they don't lie." The sheriff rubbed his chin. "Your son said there were more bodies." Samuel nodded slowly. "Yes." Rourke looked toward the mountains outside the window. "How many?" Samuel swallowed. "They didn't say." A long silence followed. Then the church door creaked open. Elias and Jonah stepped inside. Their faces looked pale. Tired. As if they hadn't slept. Rourke looked at them. "You boys got something else to tell me?" Elias nodded. "Yes." Jonah finished the sentence. "The mine isn't the worst place." Samuel felt a wave of dread crash over him. "What do you mean?" Elias slowly turned toward the church floor beneath their feet. The first ones. Jonah whispered the rest. They're buried here. The sheriff froze. Here. Elias nodded. Under the church. The wind outside suddenly slammed against the building. The old wooden walls creaked loudly. And for the first time since the Hale family arrived in Blackridge Valley, Sheriff Caleb Rourke felt a deep fear settle into his chest. Because if the boys were right again, then the town's darkest secrets weren't hidden in the mountains. They were buried directly beneath the place everyone believed was sacred. And whatever had happened there had been waiting a very long time to be discovered. The church felt colder than it should have. Not the kind of cold that came from the mountain wind slipping through cracks in the wood, but something deeper, heavier. The kind of cold that made the air feel thick and uneasy. Sheriff Caleb Rourke stood in the center aisle staring down at the wooden floorboards beneath his boots. Elias and Jonah stood a few feet away, silent as always. Samuel Hale felt his heart beating hard in his chest. You're saying, Rourke began slowly, there are bodies buried under this church? Elias nodded once. Jonah finished the thought. 3 of them. Pastor Whitaker, who had been standing near the altar, shook his head immediately. That's impossible. His voice trembled. This church was built 15 years ago. I helped lay the foundation myself. Elias looked at him gently. They were already there. The pastor's face drained of color. What? Jonah spoke quietly. The church wasn't built first. Rourke crossed his arms. What was? The twins answered together. The grave. The silence inside the church stretched painfully long. Samuel could feel dread rising in his stomach. Sheriff, he said quietly, maybe we should check. Rourke hesitated. Digging beneath a church floor was no small matter. It would cause panic in town. People were already whispering about the Hale boys. But then he remembered the mine. The hidden tunnel. The bones exactly where the boys said they would be. He slowly nodded. We'll check. Pastor Whitaker looked horrified. You can't just start digging up the church. Rourke's voice hardened. If there are murder victims buried under this floor, Pastor, then I absolutely can. Whitaker looked at the boys again. And something about their calm expressions made his protest fade. Within an hour, several miners arrived carrying tools. The church filled with uneasy murmurs as people gathered outside, trying to see through the windows. Samuel stood near the back wall with his sons. The sheriff pointed to the center aisle. Where? Elias stepped forward. He stopped halfway between the altar and the front pew. Then he pointed at the floor. Here. Rourke nodded. Start there. The sound of prying boards echoed through the church. One by one, the old planks were lifted away. Dust and packed dirt appeared beneath them. The miners began digging. At first, nothing happened. Just shovel after shovel of dark soil. Pastor Whitaker stood near the altar with his hands clasped tightly together. Lord forgive us, he whispered under his breath. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. Some people in the crowd outside began muttering that the boys were wrong. Samuel wanted them to be wrong. But he knew better. Then suddenly one of the miners stopped digging. His shovel had struck something solid. Sheriff. Rourke stepped forward. The man brushed dirt aside carefully. Something pale appeared beneath the soil. A curved shape. The miner's lantern light revealed it clearly. A skull. Someone in the crowd outside screamed. The entire church went silent. The miner slowly uncovered the rest. A human skeleton. The bones were old. Very old. Rourke removed his hat. How long? He asked quietly. One of the older miners crouched beside the grave. 10, maybe 15 years. Rourke swallowed. Keep digging. The men continued carefully. Within another 20 minutes, they uncovered 2 more skeletons beside the first. 3 bodies. Exactly like the boys said. Pastor Whitaker sank into a pew. This can't be real. Samuel watched his sons. They looked exhausted. As if every revelation drained something from them. Rourke crouched beside the remains. Who were they? He looked up at the twins. Do you know? Elias closed his eyes briefly. Jonah spoke. Travelers. Rourke frowned. Names? Elias opened his eyes again. Daniel Pierce. Jonah continued. William Carter. Elias finished. And Thomas Grant. The sheriff wrote the names down slowly. Where did they come from? Jonah whispered. East. Rourke stood and faced the growing crowd outside the church. Anyone recognize those names? No one spoke. But an old man near the back stepped forward slowly. His beard was white and his back bent with age. His name was Nathan Caldwell. One of the oldest residents in Blackridge Valley. I remember one of them, Caldwell said quietly. Which one? Pierce. Rourke stepped closer. You knew him? Caldwell nodded. He passed through here about 14 years ago. Said he was heading to Denver with money from a land sale. Samuel felt his stomach tighten. Money. Rourke noticed it too. What happened to him? Caldwell shook his head slowly. He disappeared. A murmur spread through the crowd. Sheriff Rourke looked back at the skeletons. Were they robbed? Elias nodded. Jonah whispered. Yes. Rourke's voice became harder. Who did it? For the first time, the twins hesitated. Samuel noticed their hands trembling slightly. Boys, he said gently, you don't have to. Elias interrupted softly. They were afraid. Jonah continued. They didn't mean to kill them. Rourke leaned forward. Who? The twins looked toward the crowd gathered at the church door. And for a long moment, no one moved. Then Elias slowly raised his hand. He pointed toward the back of the crowd. Toward 3 men standing near the doorway. One of them was Nathan Caldwell. The old man who had just spoken. Gasps filled the church. Caldwell stared at the boys in horror. No. Jonah's voice was barely louder than a whisper. You held the lantern. Elias continued. Samuel Pike struck the first blow. Jonah finished. And you buried them. The old man's face collapsed. His knees buckled. He sank to the ground. Oh God. Rourke stepped forward quickly. Is it true? Caldwell began to cry. We were desperate. His voice shook violently. The winter was coming. The mines were failing. Someone in the crowd shouted angrily. So you murdered travelers? Caldwell shook his head frantically. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. His voice cracked. They fought back, and Samuel panicked. Rourke's face hardened. Where are the others? Caldwell froze. What? The boys said there were more bodies. Caldwell's crying stopped. A terrible silence filled the church. Slowly, painfully, the old man looked up. How could they know that? Elias answered quietly. They never left. Jonah added. They've been waiting. Caldwell covered his face. There were 11, he whispered. A wave of shock swept through the crowd. 11 men. Samuel felt the air leave his lungs. 11. Rourke's voice dropped low. Where are the rest? Caldwell shook his head slowly. Some in the mine. His eyes moved toward the mountains. Some in the river. Then he whispered the words that made the entire church go still. And some, under the town. A terrified murmur rippled through the crowd. Samuel looked at his sons. Elias looked exhausted. Jonah's eyes were filled with quiet sadness. Rourke spoke carefully. "You're telling me this town was built with stolen money?" Caldwell nodded weakly. "The saloon, the general store, even the schoolhouse." Pastor Whitaker stood slowly. His face looked like someone had shattered his entire world. "And the church?" Caldwell looked at the graves beneath the floor. "We built it on top of them." The pastor staggered back. Samuel felt his chest tighten. The entire town of Blackridge Valley had been built on murder. The people outside began shouting. Some in anger. Some in disbelief. Rourke raised his voice. "Quiet." The crowd slowly settled. But the fear in their eyes had changed into something else. Realization. Samuel looked down at his sons. "How many more?" he whispered. Elias looked toward the mountains. Jonah finished the thought. 3. Rourke heard them. 3 more what? Elias answered. Killers. The sheriff's eyes widened. "You're saying 3 of the murderers are still alive?" Jonah nodded slowly. "They're in this town." A cold silence spread across the church. Everyone began looking around at each other. Suspicion filled the air like poison. Rourke's voice dropped to a whisper. "Who?" For the second time that day. The twins raised their hands. And pointed into the crowd. 3 different men. All respected residents of Blackridge Valley. All staring at the boys with pure terror. One of them suddenly ran for the door. "Stop him!" Rourke shouted. But before anyone could move, a gunshot exploded outside the church. People screamed. And chaos erupted. Samuel grabbed his sons immediately. Outside, a man lay bleeding in the dirt. One of the accused killers. The other 2 stood nearby. One holding a smoking revolver. The entire town watched in horror as the man lowered the gun. "We're not going back to prison," he said coldly. And in that moment, everyone realized something terrible. The crimes of Blackridge Valley were not just part of the past. They were about to become something far more dangerous. Because desperate men with nothing left to lose were now facing exposure. And they were willing to do anything. To keep the truth buried. Elias answered. Killers. The sheriff's eyes widened. "You're saying 3 of the murderers are still alive?" Jonah nodded slowly. "They're in this town." A cold silence spread across the church. Everyone began looking around at each other. Suspicion filled the air like poison. Rourke's voice dropped to a whisper. "Who?" For the second time that day. The twins raised their hands. And pointed into the crowd. 3 different men. All respected residents of Blackridge Valley. All staring at the boys with pure terror. One of them suddenly ran for the door. "Stop him!" Rourke shouted. But before anyone could move, a gunshot exploded outside the church. People screamed. And chaos erupted. Samuel grabbed his sons immediately. Outside, a man lay bleeding in the dirt. One of the accused killers. The other 2 stood nearby. One holding a smoking revolver. The entire town watched in horror as the man lowered the gun. "We're not going back to prison," he said coldly. And in that moment, everyone realized something terrible. The crimes of Blackridge Valley were not just part of the past. They were about to become something far more dangerous. Because desperate men with nothing left to lose were now facing exposure. And they were willing to do anything. To keep the truth buried. The gunshot echoed through Blackridge Valley like thunder rolling between the mountains. For a moment, no one moved. The man who had tried to run lay motionless in the dirt outside the church, blood slowly spreading beneath him. The revolver still smoked in the trembling hand of the shooter, a miner named Caleb Dorsey. People backed away from him instinctively. Fear spread through the crowd like a sickness. Sheriff Rourke stepped forward slowly, one hand hovering near his own pistol. "Dorsey," he said carefully, "put the gun down." Dorsey's eyes were wild. "You don't understand," he said hoarsely. Rourke's voice remained calm. "I understand you just shot a man in front of half the town." The second accused man, Walter Briggs, stood beside Dorsey, pale and shaking. Dorsey laughed bitterly. "You think we're going to prison for something that happened 15 years ago?" The sheriff took another step closer. "That's not your choice anymore." Dorsey glanced at the crowd surrounding the church. Dozens of people stared back at him. Some angry. Some frightened. But most of them looked betrayed. And that seemed to push Dorsey over the edge. "You all lived off that money," he shouted. The words hit the crowd like a punch. "You ate food bought with it. Your houses were built with it. Your children went to school because of it." He pointed toward the church. "Everything in this town exists because of what we did." A terrible silence followed. Because deep down, many people knew he was right. Sheriff Rourke's voice hardened. "That doesn't excuse murder." Dorsey shook his head slowly. "You don't get it." His gaze shifted past the sheriff. Toward the Hale boys. Elias and Jonah stood beside their father, watching quietly. Dorsey's expression twisted with anger. "It's their fault," he said. Samuel felt his stomach tighten. "Dorsey," he warned. But the man ignored him. "They come into our town, dig up our past, ruin everything." He raised the revolver again. And this time, he pointed it directly at the twins. The crowd gasped. Samuel stepped in front of his sons instantly. "Don't you dare." Rourke drew his pistol in one swift motion. "Dorsey, if you fire that gun." The moment stretched unbearably long. Wind howled through the street. Dorsey's hand trembled. Walter Briggs suddenly grabbed his arm. "Caleb, don't." For a second, it looked like the moment might pass. Then Elias spoke quietly from behind his father. "You didn't mean to shoot him." Everyone froze. Dorsey blinked. "What?" Jonah's voice followed. "It was supposed to scare him." Dorsey stared at them. "How could you?" Elias finished the thought. "But now you're afraid." Jonah added softly. "Because you know what happens next." Dorsey's face went pale. The revolver slowly slipped from his fingers. It fell into the dirt. Sheriff Rourke moved immediately, stepping forward and kicking the weapon away before grabbing Dorsey's arms and forcing them behind his back. "Caleb Dorsey," he said firmly, "you're under arrest." Walter Briggs didn't resist when another miner stepped forward to hold him. The crowd remained silent as the sheriff secured both men. Samuel finally turned toward his sons. His heart was still pounding. "Are you all right?" Elias nodded. Jonah looked tired. "They're getting louder," he whispered. Samuel frowned. "Who?" Elias answered. "The ones who died." A chill ran through Samuel's spine. "What do you mean?" Jonah looked toward the mountains beyond the town. "They're not finished yet." That night, Sheriff Rourke locked Dorsey and Briggs inside the small jail building near the general store. Nathan Caldwell, the old man who had confessed earlier, sat inside another cell with his head in his hands. 3 killers now waited behind bars. But the town was far from calm. People argued in the streets long after dark. Families whispered behind closed doors. Some blamed the Hale boys. Others blamed the men who had committed the crimes. And many simply didn't know what to believe anymore. Samuel sat with his sons inside Pastor Whitaker's house again. The pastor himself looked shattered. His hands shook slightly as he poured tea into cups. All these years, Whitaker murmured. I thought this was a good town. Samuel sighed quietly. It can still be. Whitaker shook his head slowly. Can it? He looked toward the boys. 3 murderers, 11 victims, bodies under the church. His voice dropped. What kind of place builds its faith on something like that? Neither twin answered. They simply stared toward the dark window again. Samuel noticed the exhaustion in their faces. Boys, he said gently, you need rest. Jonah shook his head. We can't sleep. Why? Elias whispered. They're trying to tell us something. Samuel leaned forward. Who? Jonah spoke slowly. The last 3. Samuel frowned. You mean the last 3 victims? The twins nodded. Samuel's chest tightened. What are they saying? For a moment, the boys remained silent. Then Elias spoke quietly. They didn't die in the mountains. Jonah finished the thought. They died here. Samuel felt a wave of dread wash over him. Here where? Elias slowly pointed toward the center of town. The well. The town well stood near the general store. It was old. Built when Blackridge Valley was first founded. Nearly every family in town had drawn water from it at some point. Sheriff Rourke arrived there early the next morning with several men and a lantern. Samuel and the twins stood nearby. A large crowd gathered again, whispering nervously. Rourke stared down into the darkness of the well. You boys are certain? Elias nodded. Yes. Jonah added. They were thrown in alive. A horrified murmur rippled through the crowd. Rourke rubbed his jaw. Lower the lantern. One of the miners tied a rope around the lantern and carefully lowered it into the well. The light descended slowly. 20 feet. 30. 40. Then the miner suddenly stopped. What is it? Rourke asked. The man swallowed. There's something down there. Rourke grabbed the rope and pulled the lantern up again. But before it reached the top, everyone could already see it. Bones tangled in the rope. 3 skeletons. Gasps filled the air. Some people turned away in shock. Samuel looked down at his sons. Elias looked pale. Jonah's eyes were closed. Sheriff Rourke stared at the remains. That makes 11, he said quietly. The full truth had finally emerged. 11 travelers murdered. A town built with stolen money. And bodies hidden beneath churches, mines, and wells. Blackridge Valley stood exposed. But something strange happened next. Instead of relief, the twins looked even more troubled. Samuel knelt beside them. What is it? Elias opened his eyes slowly. They're still not resting. Samuel frowned. What do you mean? Jonah whispered the answer. Because something else happened here. Sheriff Rourke overheard. What something? Elias looked toward the church again. The first one. Rourke frowned. What first one? Jonah's voice was barely louder than the wind. The one before all the others. Samuel felt a chill crawl up his back. What are you talking about? Elias looked at the sheriff. The man who started it. Rourke crossed his arms. You mean the first killer? Jonah shook his head slowly. No. His voice trembled slightly. The first victim. A heavy silence fell across the crowd. Sheriff Rourke stared at them. You're saying there was another murder? Elias nodded. Jonah whispered. He never left the town. Rourke looked around at the buildings surrounding them. Where is he? Elias pointed slowly. Not toward the mountains. Not toward the mine. Not toward the well. He pointed directly at the church. Samuel felt his heart stop for a moment. What do you mean? Jonah's voice carried quietly through the morning air. He's still inside. A cold wind swept through Blackridge Valley. And suddenly everyone realized something terrifying. If the twins were right again, then the darkest secret of the entire town had not yet been uncovered. And whatever lay hidden inside that church had been waiting longer than anyone in Blackridge Valley had ever imagined. The wind had grown stronger by the time everyone gathered outside the church again. Dark clouds rolled over the mountains like a storm waiting to break. The town of Blackridge Valley stood silent, the truth of its past weighing heavily on every soul present. Sheriff Caleb Rourke stood at the front of the crowd, staring at the church doors. Behind him stood Samuel Hale and his sons. Elias and Jonah looked exhausted, as if the weight of every secret buried in the valley pressed down on their small shoulders. Samuel knelt beside them. "Are you sure about this?" he asked softly. Elias nodded slowly. Jonah looked toward the church. "He's still there." Sheriff Rourke pushed the church doors open. They creaked loudly as they swung inward. Everyone followed him inside. The wooden floor had already been torn open where the 3 skeletons had been discovered earlier. Lanterns were placed around the hole, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The atmosphere inside felt heavier than before. Pastor Whitaker stood near the altar again, pale and trembling. "You already found the bodies beneath the floor," he said weakly. "What more could there be?" Elias stepped forward. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Under the altar." The crowd murmured uneasily. Whitaker shook his head. "That's impossible." Jonah pointed slowly toward the raised wooden platform where the altar stood. "He's under there." Sheriff Rourke looked at the platform. Then he looked back at the twins. "You're certain?" They both nodded. Rourke turned to the miners. "Move it." The men hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. The altar was heavy, but within minutes they had pushed it aside. Beneath it lay another section of wooden flooring. Rourke crouched down and pried one of the boards loose. Dust and dirt spilled upward as the plank lifted away. The miners began digging again. The entire church watched in silence. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Samuel could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Then suddenly, "Sheriff!" One of the miners' voices trembled. Rourke stepped closer. The lantern light revealed something beneath the soil. Not just bones. Clothing. Old clothing. Carefully buried. The miners cleared the dirt slowly. Soon a full skeleton emerged. But unlike the others, this one was different. A rusted revolver lay beside the bones. And something else. A small leather journal. Sheriff Rourke picked it up carefully. Dust fell from the cover as he opened it. Inside were faded handwritten pages. Samuel stepped closer. "What does it say?" Rourke read the first line silently. Then his expression changed. "Who wrote it?" Samuel asked. Rourke looked up slowly. "The man buried here." Pastor Whitaker leaned against the wall for support. "Who was he?" Rourke flipped to the first page. A name was written at the top. Henry Whitaker. The pastor froze. That's my father's name." Every eye in the church turned toward him. Rourke continued reading. The journal pages were shaky but clear. Henry Whitaker had arrived in the valley 16 years earlier. He had come searching for land to build a church. But what he found instead was a group of desperate miners. Men who had already begun robbing travelers passing through the mountains. Henry Whitaker had tried to stop them. He had threatened to report them to the authorities in Denver. The journal described the confrontation in detail. Samuel felt a chill crawl down his spine as Rourke read aloud. Henry Whitaker had confronted the men one night near the town well. He had begged them to stop. But the men feared exposure. So they made a decision that would shape the fate of the valley forever. They killed him. Pastor Whitaker's hands shook violently. No. Rourke turned another page. After the murder, the miners panicked. They buried Henry beneath the ground where the church would eventually be built. Then they used the stolen money to construct the town around it. A town that would appear honest and hardworking. A town built to hide their crime. Samuel looked toward his sons. Elias and Jonah watched silently, as if they had already known the truth. Rourke closed the journal slowly. So the first victim wasn't a traveler, he said quietly. It was the man who tried to stop them. Pastor Whitaker sank into a pew, tears streaming down his face. They killed my father. Jonah spoke gently. He never left. The pastor looked up at the boys. What do you mean? Elias answered softly. He stayed to watch. Samuel felt a strange calm settle over the church. For the first time since arriving in Blackridge Valley, the twins looked peaceful. As if the voices they had heard were finally quiet. Sheriff Rourke looked around at the townspeople gathered inside. You've all heard the truth, he said firmly. This town was built on murder and stolen money. The people shifted uneasily. But Rourke continued. That doesn't mean it has to stay that way. He pointed toward the grave beneath the altar. This man tried to stop those crimes. He looked at Pastor Whitaker. Your father tried to do the right thing. The pastor wiped his eyes slowly. What happens now? Rourke answered honestly. Now we make it right. Over the next several days, the town of Blackridge Valley began to change. The bodies of the 11 murdered travelers were recovered and prepared for proper burial. Henry Whitaker's remains were placed in a coffin at the center of the church. The townspeople gathered together for the largest funeral the valley had ever seen. Sheriff Rourke personally escorted Caleb Dorsey, Walter Briggs, and Nathan Caldwell to the nearest federal court days later. The truth of the murders spread beyond the mountains. Newspapers from Denver printed the story. But something else happened in Blackridge Valley. Something unexpected. The townspeople began rebuilding. The stolen money that had once funded the town was repaid through years of labor and mining profits. The church was rebuilt entirely. And this time, it was built honestly. On the day the new church opened, Pastor Whitaker stood before the congregation. Samuel Hale and his sons sat quietly in the back row. Whitaker looked at them with gratitude. Sometimes, the pastor said softly, the truth comes from the most unexpected places. Elias and Jonah looked at each other. For the first time since arriving in the valley. They both smiled. Samuel noticed it immediately. Are they gone? He whispered. Jonah nodded. They're resting now. Elias added quietly. They waited a long time. Samuel placed a gentle hand on each of their shoulders. Outside the church, the wind moved gently through the valley. The mountains stood silent as always. But something in Blackridge Valley had changed forever. The past had finally been uncovered. The secrets buried beneath the earth had been brought into the light. And the voices that had once haunted the valley were finally at peace. As the Hale family prepared to leave town the following morning, Sheriff Rourke walked them to the edge of the road. You boys ever been wrong before? He asked. Elias thought for a moment. Sometimes. Rourke smiled slightly. Well, you weren't wrong here. Samuel shook the sheriff's hand. Take care of this town. Rourke looked back toward the buildings of Blackridge Valley. I will. The wagon began rolling slowly down the dusty road. As the Hale family disappeared into the mountain pass, the sun rose behind them. And for the first time in many years, Blackridge Valley felt like a place that might finally have a future. Not built on secrets, but on truth.